The dismissal, when it came, was as quiet and damp as the November afternoon on which it was delivered. There was no shouting, no grand accusation. There was only Lady Atherton, her finger tracing the rim of a teacup, her voice a silken blade. "Stock, we feel, Miss Vance, that your methods are perhaps too stimulating for the girls. They have become argumentative." Harriet Vance kept her hands folded in her lap, the worn gray wool of her gloves hiding the ink stains she could never quite scrub from her fingers. She had taught the Atherton girls to ask why. It was a fatal error. A poor gentlewoman with opinions was a luxury no household could afford, and a governess who taught her charges to have them was a menace. "I see," Harriet said. The words were calm, level. Inside, a familiar cold dread began to seep into the floor of her stomach. She had £20 to her name, and no prospect of a reference. Lady Atherton's next words confirmed it. "Of course, we could not in good conscience recommend a placement where such a disruption might occur. We will, naturally, pay you through the end of the week." It was a severance. A polite, brutal cutting of the cord that had tethered her to shelter and sustenance. Harriet inclined her head, a gesture of submission she had perfected over a decade of such positions. She did not argue, she did not plead. She had learned long ago that the moment a woman like Lady Atherton decided you were inconvenient, you had already ceased to exist. To protest was merely to make a scene in an empty room. She packed her single trunk in the fading light, the scent of beeswax and damp London air, clinging to her few possessions. Her books, her worn copies of Euclid, and a treatise on estate management her father had treasured, went in first, the hard spines, a comfort against the fraying fabric of her life. She was 28 years old, the daughter of a country solicitor who had possessed a brilliant mind for numbers and a disastrous one for investments. He had left her with a sharp intellect and a pile of debts she had spent 10 years working to clear. Now finally clear of them, she was adrift. The employment agency in a narrow street off the Strand was her last hope. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet wool and desperation. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched from the sour disappointments of others, looked over Harrieta's papers with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. A no reference from Lady Atherton, she stated not a question. A disagreement on educational philosophy, a Harriet said, the phrase polished by use. Mrs. Gable sniffed. That is a death sentence, Miss Vance. And you know it. No one will take a governess who comes with a disagreement. She shuffled through a stack of cards, her expression grim. There is nothing for you. Unless She paused, pulling a single card from the bottom of the pile. It was slightly dog-eared, as if it had been handled and rejected many times. You have a stomach for lost causes. Harriet Hart gave a painful thump. Have a stomach for employment. Mrs. Gable. The Duke of Blackwood. A widower. He needs a governess for his daughter. Immediately. A duke. The word hung in the stale air, impossibly grand. Dukes did not hire governesses from agencies like this. They had lists. They had recommendations from other duchesses. Mrs. Gable seemed to read her thoughts. Oh, he has been through the lists, and the recommendations, and the cousins of friends. 3 governesses in the last 6 months. The first lasted a fortnight. The last fled in tears after 3 days. The child, they say, is impossible. Silent. Utterly, unnervingly silent. Will not speak, will not respond. Just a watches. She pushed the card across the desk. The address is for his London residence, Grimsby House, on St. James's Square. The interview is this afternoon. His Grace is desperate. I warn you, it is a fool's errand, a silent child, a desperate duke. It was not a position, it was a ghost story. But the £20 in her reticule felt thinner and lighter than they had an hour ago. I will go, Harriet said, self-sufficient, the word her father had used to praise her. Now. It felt like the name for a horse that did not need to be fed. Grimsby House was not a house. It was a monument, a vast, pale stone facade that seemed to absorb the grey London light and give nothing back. It was immaculate, the brass on the great black door polished to a fearsome gleam, the windows spotless panes of black glass, but it felt cold. Not just the chill of the November air, but a deeper, more structural cold, as if the fires within had been banked for a very long time. A house that counted its candles, a footman, whose face was as blank and polished as the door, led her through a hall of marble and shadow. The silence was the first thing she noticed. In a ducal residence, there should have been the hum of a dozen servants, the distant clatter of the kitchens, the murmur of life. Here, there was only the echo of her own footsteps on the stone. It was the silence of a tomb. She was shown into a library that was more of a cavern, lined floor to ceiling with books that looked as though they had not been touched in a generation. A low fire guttered in the grate, fighting a losing battle against the chill. Two men stood before it. One was slight and impeccably dressed, his face arranged in an expression of handsome sympathy. The other was the Duke. Harriet knew it instantly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in severe black, his presence sucking the very air from the room. He was not handsome in the way the other man was. His features were too harsh, his jaw too rigid, his eyes a startling pale gray, the color of a winter sea. He looked less like a duke and more like a craggy headland, something carved by centuries of wind and grief. This was a man who had been orphaned young, handed a title and its crushing weight before he had even understood loss. The grief had not softened him, it had frozen him. He noticed things. She saw it in the first instant. His gaze swept over her, not with the leisurely assessment of a man judging horseflesh, but with a quick, incisive inventory. He noticed the worn nap of her gloves, the careful mend on her collar, the slight tremor in her hand as she held her reticule. He noticed that she did not flinch from his stare. His attention was a physical weight. "A Miss Vance," he said. His voice was low and devoid of warmth, a sound that matched the house. "I am Blackwood." The other man stepped forward, his smile smooth. "And I am Alistair Finch, his gracious cousin." "A pleasure." He was all warmth and charm, a stark contrast to the Duke's Arctic reserve, but his eyes, as they met Henrietta's, were sharp and calculating. They held no warmth at all. "You have been told the circumstances," the Duke stated, cutting through any pleasantries. It was not a question. "Ah, Mrs. Gable was concise," Harriet replied, her voice steady. My daughter, Clara, is 7, the Duke said, his gaze fixed on the fire. Her mother, the Duchess, passed away a year ago. Since then, Clara has not spoken. Not a word. The governesses we have employed have found her unresponsive. They found her an unnerving little ghost." Alistair Finch supplied, his tone soft and pitying. The poor man," his expression said, so burdened. "Bah!" The Duke's jaw tightened a flicker of muscle beneath the skin. He did not appreciate his cousin's commentary. The position requires a woman of unusual patience and fortitude. It is, I am told, an impossible task. He was testing her, daring her to retreat. He expected her to make her excuses and flee, just as the others had. The cold dread in her stomach was a solid knot now, but something else rose to meet it, a flicker of defiance. She was tired of being dismissed. "I do not believe in impossible tasks, Your Grace," she said, "only tasks for which the correct method has not yet been found." For the first time a flicker of something, a surprise, perhaps interest, crossed the Duca's frozen features. He turned from the fire and looked at her fully. He truly looked at her. It felt like being caught in a sudden, unexpected beam of winter sunlight. "I am desperate, Miss Vance," he said, the admission blunt and stripped of any ducal pride. He needed an ally, a solution, and he needed one now. His enemies were not at the gates. They were in his own house, wearing sympathetic smiles. The position is yours, if you will accept it. Alistair Finch's smile tightened at the edges. He had not expected this. He had expected another weeping governess, another victory for the narrative of the Duke's incompetence. Harriet felt the ground shift beneath her feet. An hour ago, she had been destitute. Now, a Duke was offering her a post no one else would take. It was a lifeline, but it felt like a leash. She could feel the weight of this silent house, this grieving man, this lost child, settling on her shoulders. She could accept gratefully a poor relation taking whatever scraps were offered, or she could be the woman her father had raised her to be. She took a breath. Before I accept your grace, I have conditions." The silence that followed was profound. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Alistair Finch's eyebrows rose in theatrical astonishment. A penniless, unreferenced governess, setting terms for a duke? It was unthinkable. Gabriel, Duke of Blackwood, simply watched her, his pale eyes unreadable. He had expected gratitude, perhaps tears of relief. It was the second time in as many minutes she had surprised him. "State them," he said, his voice flat. Harriet met his gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated by the rank, the wealth, or the coldness that radiated from him like the chill from a block of ice. First," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I will require complete authority in all matters concerning the nursery and your daughter's education. I will not have my methods questioned or countermanded by any other member of the household." Her eyes flickered for a barest second toward Alistair Finch, a small, sharp signal that she had already taken his measure. Finch's pleasant mask tightened. He saw the flicker, and he knew it was for him a second. Harriet continued, her attention returning fully to the Duke. "I will not participate in any deception regarding the late Duchess. I will not pretend she did not exist, nor will I forbid her name from being spoken. Grief is not an illness to be hidden away. A memory that is loved should be given air to breathe." This struck a chord. The muscle in the Duke's jaw worked again, but this time it was not from irritation. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. He had tried to bury his wife's memory, thinking it would protect his daughter, but it had only created a suffocating silence. This plain-spoken woman, with her mended collar and her steady eyes, had just articulated the very truth he had been too afraid to face. Her portrait remains covered in the gallery," he said. The words, quiet, almost a confession. "Then it should be uncovered," Harriet replied simply. "A child cannot mourn a ghost. She must be allowed to remember a person, honor the dead." It was a principle so basic, yet so profoundly absent from this house of mourning. And third, Ada," Harriet said, her final condition. While I am in your employ, I am to be treated as the head of my department, not as a hired companion to be ignored until needed. I will take my meals in my own rooms, but I expect the courtesy of being informed of household matters that pertain to my charge." She was not asking for a place at his table. She was demanding respect for her position. She would not be furniture. She would not be invisible. She finished, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had likely just talked herself out of the only chance she had. She had gambled her last few shillings on the bet that this man, for all his coldness, valued substance over servility. Alistair Finch let out a small, almost inaudible scoff. Well," he murmured, as if to the room at large. For a woman in your position, Miss Vance, you certainly do not lack for audacity." The Duke turned his head slowly and fixed his cousin with a look of such arctic disdain that Finch actually took a step back. "Be silent, Alistair Baugh." Gabriel said, his voice dangerously low. He then turned back to Harriet. He was a man accustomed to command, to having his will be law. And this woman, who had nothing, had just commanded him. She had walked into his cold, broken house and begun to set it in order before she had even been hired. He saw the sharp, clear lines of her logic. the unbending steel of her integrity. He had been drowning in the sympathetic, cloying pity of men, like his cousin, and her blunt, bracing honesty was like a sudden gulp of clean, cold air. He had been looking for a governess. He was beginning to suspect he had found something else. "Entirely your conditions are acceptable," he said. The word felt inadequate. They were not acceptable. They were necessary. They were the first sensible things he had heard in a year. "You will find no interference from me, or from anyone else." The last words were a clear warning to his cousin. He saw the barely perceptible relaxing of her shoulders, the small controlled exhale. She had won her gamble. Then I accept the position, Your Grace?" she said. "Good," he replied. The housekeeper. Croft will show you to your rooms. You may begin tomorrow." He turned back to the fire. A clear dismissal. The brief connection was severed. The wall of ice was back in place. But as Harriet followed the housekeeper from the room, she felt his eyes on her back. He was watching her go. And for the first time since she had entered Grimsby House, she did not feel the chill of the place, but rather the focused, assessing heat of the Duque's attention. He had seen her. The upper floors of Grimsby House were as silent as the grand halls below. It was a silence that felt curated, managed. The servants moved like ghosts, their expressions carefully blank. They had learned that noise and emotion were unwelcome here. Mrs. Bax, Croft, the housekeeper, was a thin, anxious woman who seemed to be perpetually wringing her hands in the folds of her apron. The nursery wing is this way, miss," she whispered, as if the very walls might be listening. Lady Clara, she does not like surprises." On. The nursery was a suite of rooms at the back of the house, overlooking a small, walled garden, now brown and skeletal in the winter light. The rooms were beautiful, filled with expensive toys and silk cushions, but they were sterile. There was no clutter, no sign of a childless life. It was a showroom for a daughter, not a home for one. And in a chair by the window, a small figure in a black dress sat perfectly still. This was Clara. She was a miniature of her father, with the same pale, watchful eyes and a solemn little face that seemed too old for her 7 years. She did not look up when they entered. Her attention was fixed on the object in her lap. It was a small, beautiful abacus, its wooden frame worn smooth, its beads of polished jade and ivory. She was not playing with it. She was just holding it, her small fingers wrapped tightly around its frame, as if it were a holy relic. "Lady Clara," Mrs. Croft said, her voice trembling slightly. This is Miss Vance, your new governess." Clara gave no sign that she had heard. Her gaze remained on the abacus. Harriet stepped forward slowly. She did not approach the child directly. Instead, she walked to the heavy velvet curtains that shrouded the window, and with a soft rasp of brass rings on a wooden pole, drew them open. Watery afternoon light flooded the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Croft gasped, "Oh, miss. His Grace prefers the curtains drawn." "Oh, her Grace, the late Duchess, preferred the morning sun," Harriet said quietly, her voice gentle but firm. "I read her letters. She wrote of it often. It was a guess, a calculated one, based on the orientation of the room. But it was also a statement. The dead would be honored here." Clara's head lifted, just a fraction. Her pale eyes flickered toward Harriet, a brief, assessing glance, before returning to the abacus in her lap. It was the first sign of life. Harriet did not press her advantage. She did not try to speak to the child again. Instead, she began her work. She spent the rest of the day in quiet, purposeful activity. She unpacked her trunk, setting her few books on a small shelf. She aired out the room, opening a window a crack to let in the damp London air, chasing out the stale scent of potpourri and sorrow. She moved a small table and chair closer to the window, creating a space for lessons that looked out onto the garden, not into the shadows of the room. She did not try to win Clara with charm or coaxing. She knew, with an instinct she could not name, that this child was not difficult or defiant. She was terrified. The silence was not a weapon, it was a shield. Harrietta's strategy was simple. She would become a safe, predictable part of the landscape. She would be the chair that was always in its place, the clock that always ticked. She would stay. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Harriet would rise, take her solitary breakfast, and then go to the nursery. She would sit at the table by the window and work, sometimes on lesson plans, sometimes on her own figures, practicing the elegant, looping script of accounting her father had taught her. She never demanded Clara's attention. She simply existed in the same space, a quiet, constant presence. She spoke to the child but never expecting a reply. A good morning, Clara. The sun is trying its best. Today, I think I shall read for a while. This is a story about a ship that sails to the moon. She would read aloud, her voice a low, even murmur. A thread of sound in the vast silence. Clara watched. From her chair she watched every movement, her pale eyes tracking Harriet as she moved about the room. She watched Harriet polish the worn frame of the abacus one afternoon, her hands gentle and careful. She watched as Harriet, finding a small dead bird in the garden, buried it with solemn care beneath a rosebush. She watched, and she learned. She learned that Harriet was not afraid of the quiet. She learned that Harriet did not try to take the abacus from her. She learned that Harriet was not like the others. The Duke, too, was watching. Gabriel had expected to be summoned to the nursery within days to find another governess in tears, another failure to add to his ledger of loss. But the summons never came. Instead, a strange sort of peace began to settle over the upper floors of his house. The oppressive silence was still there, but it was different. It was no longer the silence of a held breath, but the quiet of a waiting room. He began to find reasons to walk past the nursery. He would see her through the open door, sitting in the patch of sunlight, her head bent over a book, his daughter a few feet away, a still and silent sentinel. He saw the curtains drawn back, and he did not order them closed. He saw her competence, her unnerving patience, her refusal to be cowed by his daughter's grief or his own. He had hired her to solve a problem. He found himself studying her as if she were a complex equation he could not yet solve. One afternoon, he was passing when he heard a sound so unfamiliar, he stopped dead in the hallway. It was a soft, clicking noise. He looked into the nursery. Harriet was at her table, working. And across from her, Clara was sitting at the table for the first time. She had pushed the abacus across the polished wood. With one hesitant finger, she slid a single jade bead from one side to the other. Click! It was the loudest sound he had heard in a year. It was Harrietta's own ledgers that began to trouble her. She had been granted a small budget for the nursery offer books, slates, and other supplies. The sums were dispensed by the housekeeper, who got them from the Duke's man of business, who answered, it seemed, to Alistair Finch. When Harriet requested funds, they were provided, but when she saw the household account book to sign for them, the numbers were wrong. A request for £2 for books was logged as 5. A shilling for new chalk was recorded as 10. The overages were small, almost negligible, a kind of financial mist, but Harriet's mind, trained by her father, saw patterns in mist. She began to keep a second set of books, a shadow ledger hidden in the bottom of her trunk. In it, she recorded every expense she truly incurred, next to the expense the household ledger claimed. A discrepancy began to grow, a quiet, steady siphoning of funds, all signed off with Alistair Finch's elegant flourish. He was bleeding the estate, drop by drop, in a way no one would ever notice. No one, except a dismissed governess with a mind for numbers. The breakthrough with Clara, when it came, was about numbers too. Harriet had been explaining a simple sum, more to herself than to the child, moving the beads on an imaginary abacus in the air. If you have 10 apples and you give away 3, you are left with 7. From across the room, Clara watched her. Then she looked down at the abacus in her lap. For a year, it had been a talisman, a relic of her mother. Now, for the first time, she saw it as a tool. Her mother had not just held it. Harriet saw the shift in the child's gaze. She laid her own work aside. Your mother was a brilliant mathematician. Clara, she said softly. Your father told me. He said she could make numbers sing. Clara's head shot up. Her eyes, wide and luminous, fixed on Harriet. He said she loved her work. Harriet continued, choosing her words with care. That it was a kind of music to her. It was not the numbers that made her tired, Clara. It was the illness. The numbers were her joy. This was the heart of the specific wound. Harriet had pieced it together from whispers and observations. The late Duchess had worked herself to exhaustion, fighting her illness while managing the complex finances of two ducal estates. Alistair Finch, with his cloying sympathy, had likely murmured to a grieving child, "A poor thing, all those dreadful numbers wore your dear mamma away." And Clara, in the way of children, had taken the blame. She believed her mother's passion, a passion she was beginning to feel in herself, was a poison. She believed she had inherited a curse. Harrieta's words were the antidote. They were permission. Slowly, deliberately, Clara pushed her chair back and walked to the table. She placed the abacus on the wood between them. Her hand trembled. She looked at Harriet, a silent, desperate question in her eyes. Harriet simply nodded. Clara reached out and slid a single ivory bead across the wire, then another, and another. 3 beads. Then she looked at Harriet and whispered a single, rusty word. A 7. It was the cracking of a dam. After that first word, others followed. First about numbers, then about the garden, then about the book Harriet was reading. Within a fortnight, Clara was speaking in full sentences, her voice a light, clear treble that seemed to chase the shadows from the room. She began to laugh, a sound that made the footmen stop in the halls and stare. The house began to change. The servants, seeing the child's transformation, began to unhunch their shoulders. Mrs. Croft stopped whispering and spoke in a normal tone. The oppressive silence was replaced by the sound of a child's footsteps, the click of the abacus, the murmur of lessons. The house was slowly, tentatively beginning to breathe again, and Gabriel watched it all. He saw his daughter, who he thought was lost to him, return to the world of the living. He saw her smile. He saw her run into the garden, her hand tucked firmly in Harriet's. And he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that it was all because of this one quiet, stubborn woman. He started seeking her out. He would appear in the nursery under the pretext of seeing Clara, but his eyes would be on Harriet. He asked her opinion on a dispute with a tenant farmer, and she gave him a clear, logical solution that had eluded his own land agent. He showed her the estate ledgers, a vast, chaotic mess left by his father, and she saw, in an hour, the structural problems his highly paid men of business had been circling for years. You have a remarkable mind, Miss Vance," he said one evening, after she had untangled a particularly thorny problem of crop rotation yields. They were in the library, the same room where he had hired her. The air was still cool, but the fire burned brightly now. My father believed a woman's mind was no different from a man's," she replied, looking at the columns of figures. He felt it was a waste to teach it only embroidery. My wife believed the same." Gabriel," said his voice quiet. It was the first time he had mentioned the Duchess to her directly. She managed everything. After she was gone, he trailed off, the words failing him. After she was gone, the world had become a language he no longer understood. The coldness, the rigid control of it, was all armor against the terrifying chaos of his own grief. You do not have to manage everything alone, Your Grace," Harriet said, her gaze still on the ledger. It was a simple statement of fact, but in the quiet of the library, it landed with the force of a vow. He found himself relying on her calm, on her clarity, on the steady, quiet competence that seemed to radiate from her. The chill in his own heart, the permafrost of grief and duty, was beginning to thaw at the edges. He started to feel a warmth he hadn't felt in years, a dangerous, unsettling warmth that felt like hope. He did not yet have a name for it. He only knew that the thought of Grimsby House, without Harriet Vance in it, was becoming, day by day, more and more unthinkable. He had hired a governess to save his daughter. He had not expected she would begin to save him too. Men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all, and grief makes fools of the cleverest of us. He saw the effect she had, but he did not yet understand the cause. He saw the warmth returning to his house, but he thought it was for his daughter. He felt the ground steadying beneath his own feet, but he credited it to the resolution of estate matters. He did not see the truth that was standing right in front of him, that Harriet Vance was not just a competent employee. She was becoming the heart of his house and of his life. The threat, when it landed, was a formal, legal document delivered by a clerk on a Tuesday morning. It was a petition filed in the Court of Chancery by Mr. Culloch's Perret, Alistair Finch, for the stewardship of the Blackwood estate and the legal guardianship of Lady Clara. The grounds were devastatingly simple: that Gabriel, Duke of Blackwood, due to his prolonged and debilitating grief, was no longer of sound mind or judgment, and was proving incompetent in the management of his vast financial affairs, and most cruelly in the care of his only child. Gabriel read the document in his library, the room where life had just begun to return. The words on the page were a death sentence. Finch had been preparing this for months. His feigned sympathy, his constant presence, his helpful management of the household accounts had all been research. He had been gathering evidence for his coup. His proof, Gabriel said, his voice a low growl. A set of ledgers showing the estate is on the verge of collapse. He threw a sheaf of papers onto the desk. They were beautifully copied, the figures neat and damning, and they were all lies. The lies Harriet had been quietly tracking for weeks in her secret book. Alister's masterstroke was his stated motive. He was not a villain, the petition claimed. He was a concerned cousin, a loyal family member, forced to take this drastic, painful step only to protect the Blackwood legacy and to save his beloved young cousin Clara from her father's tragic decline. It was a mirror of a grievance. It looked like love, like duty. It was a poison, coated in sugar. The hearing was set for the end of the week. It was a disaster. Gabriel's own solicitor was grim. He has documents, Your Grace, accounts. Signed by your own hand or by Finch on your authority. To dispute them would be to say either that you are a fool who doesn't read what he signs, or that you have been willfully negligent. Both arguments support his case. A panic, cold and absolute, seized Gabriel. For a year, he had held his world together with rigid, icy control. Now, the ice was cracking, and he was falling through. They would take Clara. They would strip him of his duties, his name, his purpose. He would be a prisoner in his own life, managed by the smiling, venomous pity of his cousin. That evening, he found Harriet in the nursery. She was reading to Clara, her voice a calm, steady anchor in his swirling terror. Clara, curled against her side, was asleep, the abacus resting on the floor beside her. The scene was so peaceful, so normal. It was like a knife to the heart. This was what he was about to lose. He waited until she had put the child to bed. He followed her out into the hallway, his composure shattering. He will take her from me, he said, his voice raw, stripped of all ducal authority. Avance, what am I to do? He did not call her Miss Vance, just Vance, a comrade, an ally. She looked at him at the desperation in his pale eyes. All her instincts, all her training, screamed at her to be cautious, to remain the employee. But what she saw was not a duke. It was a terrified father. We will fight him, Your Grace. She said, his numbers are lies. I can prove it. He stared at her, hope warring with despair in his face. He reached out his hand, hovering in the air between them, almost touching her arm. "I need he began. The confession was right there on the tip of his tongue. "I need you." The words were a terrifying weight, a surrender of the control he had clung to for so long, and he could not say them. The habit of a lifetime, the frozen mask of the Duke, slammed back into place. To admit need was to admit weakness. And weakness was what Alistair was using to destroy him. He saw her, in that moment, not as his salvation, but as another vulnerability, another person whose fate was tied to his, another person he would fail. He had to get her out. He had to protect her from the wreckage. He dropped his hand. His face went cold, the warmth vanishing as if a door had been slammed shut. This is no place for you, Miss Vance," he said, his voice suddenly formal, arctic. The house is falling. My affairs are in chaos. You have done wonders with my daughter, more than I could have ever asked. You are owed a debt of gratitude, and I will repay it." Harriet stared at him, bewildered by the sudden brutal shift. Your Grace, I do not understand." I am releasing you from your position," he said, the words like chips of ice. "I will give you a year's wages. I will write you a reference that will guarantee you a position with the finest families in England. You have saved my daughter from her silence. Now, save yourself." He was pushing her away, pushing her toward safety. In his panicked, grief-stricken mind, it was an act of kindness, a final, desperate attempt to do something right. But the words he chose were a different kind of blade. Find someone who needs you, Miss Vance," he said, his voice flat and empty. Someone you can actually save. Find someone who needs you." The words echoed in the silent hallway. It was the most profound, most absolute dismissal she had ever received. He was not just firing her, he was telling her she was of no use to him. He did not need her. After everything, after the quiet trust built over weeks, after the shared work and the dawning hope, he was erasing her from the equation. He was closing the ledger. She stood there, stunned, into silence. The cruelty of it, stealing her breath. She had let herself hope. She had let herself believe that she was becoming more than just useful. It was a fool's hope, and this was her punishment for it. As you wish, Your Grace," she whispered. Her own voice sounded foreign to her, a thin, brittle thing. She turned, without another word, and walked back to her room, her back straight, her head held high. She would not let him see her break. From the end of the hall, Gabriel watched her go. He watched her walk away, and a chasm opened up in his chest. He had done the right thing, the honorable thing. He had sent her to safety, so why did it feel like he had just severed his own right arm? Harriet packed her trunk for the second time in as many months. This time, the movements were mechanical, numb. She folded her dresses, her linens, her few personal effects. At the bottom, she placed her father's books. And on top of them, she laid the shadow ledger. Her first instinct was to burn it, to destroy the evidence of her foolishness, of the hope she had allowed to kindle. He had paid her, dismissed her, told her to find someone else who needed her. She owed him nothing. She could take the generous settlement and the glowing reference and disappear. She could find a comfortable position with a family that was not drowning in grief and intrigue. She could be safe. She closed the lid of the trunk and sat down on the edge of her bed. The silence of the house pressed in on her. But this time, it was not empty. It was filled with the echo of his words. Find someone who needs you. He had meant it as a dismissal. But as she sat there, the phrase began to change its shape in her mind. Who needed her? Not the Duke, clearly. He had made that painfully plain. But what about Clara? Clara, who had just found her voice. Clara, who was just learning that numbers were not a poison. Clara, who would be handed over to the guardianship of a man who saw her as a pawn and a purse. A man who had likely whispered the poison in her ear in the first place. If Harriet left, Alistair Finch would win. He would take control of the estate, and he would take control of the child. He would undo everything Harriet had worked for. The curtains would be drawn again. The silence would return. Deeper and more permanent this time. Clara would be lost again, and this time there would be no one to find her. The rage when it came was a clean, hot flame that burned away the numb shock. It was not a rage at the Duke for his cruel, clumsy rejection. It was a rage at the injustice of it all. At Alistair Finch and his smiling villainy. At a world where a good man could be destroyed by a clever lie, and a childless future could be gambled away like a chit at a gaming table. She stood up. She walked to her trunk and opened it. She took out the shadow ledger. Her decision was made. The Duke had told her to find someone who needed her. She had. And they were right here in this house. She did not go to the Duke. His pride was a fortress she could not breach. Instead, the next morning, she took a cab to the dusty, book-lined offices of Messrs. Coulson and Phipps, the Duke of Blackwood's solicitors. Mr. Coulson, a man who looked as though he had been grown from old parchment, received her with weary courtesy. He assumed she was there to collect a final payment or resolve some detail of her dismissal. Your Grace was most generous, he began, ready to expedite her departure. I am not here about my wages? Mr. Coulson, Aisha, Harriet said, placing the ledger on his desk. I am here about the Duque. The Court of Chancery was a place of grim, wood-paneled solemnity. It smelled of old paper, beeswax, and the slow decay of justice. Gabriel stood with his solicitor, his face a mask of stone. He had slept little, the scene in the hallway replaying in his mind. The image of Harrieta's stricken face a brand on his memory. He had told himself it was for the best. He was still telling himself that, but the words rang hollow even in his own head. Alistair Finch was across the room, the picture of concerned gravity. He had brought Clara with him. It was a masterfully cruel touch. The child sat on a bench, small and silent, clutching her abacus. She had not spoken a word since Harriet had left the house that morning. The light had gone out of her. She was a ghost again, and her presence was a constant damning accusation against her father. The magistrate, a stern-faced man named Sir John Rowe, began the proceedings. Alistair's solicitor laid out the case, presenting the falsified ledgers, quoting from doctors who had attended the late Duchess and could testify to Gabriel's overwhelming grief. It was a meticulous, damning performance. Gabriel felt the net closing around him. He had no defense. The numbers were lies, but he had no proof. The evidence of financial mismanagement is compelling, Sir John said, his gaze on Gabriel, and the testimony regarding your Grace's emotional state is troubling. But the primary concern of this court is the welfare of the child Pertine. He turned his gaze to Clara. Lady Clara, can you tell me who looks after you? Clara did not move. She stared down at her lap, her knuckles white where she gripped the abacus. It is as we have said, Sir John, Alistair's solicitor said smoothly. The child is withdrawn, neglected. Her father's grief has rendered him incapable of providing the stable environment she requires. It was the killing blow. The room was silent. Gabriel felt a cold sweat on his brow. He had lost. He had failed everyone. The court is prepared to, Sir John began. Your pardon, Sir John. Mr. Coulson, Gabriel's solicitor, stepped forward. His expression was no longer grim. It was something akin to triumphant. We have one more witness to call. The witness list is closed at. Alistair's solicitor snapped. This is a witness to rebut the financial evidence presented this morning, Coulson said calmly. I believe the court will find her testimony highly relevant. Sir John hesitated, then nodded. Very well. Call your witness. The defense calls Miss Harriet Vance. The name fell into the room like a stone into a still pond. Gabriel's head jerked up. He stared, disbelieving, as the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. She walked in. She was dressed in her simple gray traveling suit, Her face pale, but composed. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be halfway to a new life, safe from all of this. But she was here. She walked past Alistair Finch, who stared at her as if he were seeing a ghost, his handsome face suddenly slack with shock. She walked past Gabriel, her eyes fixed forward, not giving him so much as a glance. She took the witness stand and swore the oath. Her voice, the only sound in the stunned silence. A Miss Vance, Mr. Coulson began. You were until this morning employed as governess to Lady Clara. I was, she said. And in the course of your duties, you had cause to review the household accounts. I did. But, and did you find them to be in order? No, Harriet said. I did not. And then, with the shadow ledger open before her, she began to speak. She did not use rhetoric or emotion. She used numbers, calmly, clearly, and with devastating precision. She dismantled Alistair Finch's entire fabrication. She went through his ledgers, line by line, and compared them to her own. On the 10th of October, the household accounts record a payment of £10 for new linens for the nursery. The actual expenditure, for which I have the receipt from the vendor, was £2. The difference of £8 was signed for by Mr. Finch. On the 12th, a payment of £5 for books. The actual cost was £1 10s. The difference again was authorized by Mr. Finch. On and on she went. It was a litany of petty theft, a death by 1,000 cuts. She unraveled the scheme with the cold, irrefutable logic of mathematics. She was not just a governess. She was a forensic accountant, and the courtroom was her classroom. She showed how the small, daily thefts, compounded over a year, created the illusion of a failing estate. She proved that the house was not bleeding money through neglect. It was being bled deliberately by the man who now claimed to be its savior. When she finished, there was a profound silence. Alistair Finch was ashen. His clever, sympathetic narrative had been shredded by plain, brutal arithmetic. Sir John Rowe looked from the ledger to Finch, his expression like granite. Mr. Finch, do you have a response to this remarkable testimony? Finch opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was ruined, but the final blow did not come from the magistrate. It came from the child. Clara had been watching Harriet, her eyes wide. As Harriet finished her testimony, a slow smile spread across the child's face. She let go of her abacus. It fell to the floor with a clatter, and for the first time that day, she spoke. She did not look at her father. She did not look at the magistrate. She looked straight at Alistair Finch, the man who had tried to steal her future, the man who had poisoned her mother's memory. All are, she said, her voice ringing out in the silent courtroom, clear and strong. Miss Vance taught me that. Then she turned her gaze to the magistrate. She stayed, Clara said, her voice softening. She pointed a small, determined finger at Harriet. Miss Vance stayed, the declaration of belonging. It was the truest testimony given all day. It was not about numbers or ledgers. It was about loyalty. About the woman who, when told to leave, had chosen to stay and fight. The case collapsed. Alistair Finch was not merely defeated. He was erased. The room which had been filled with his cloying presence was now simply empty of him. He was irrelevant. Gabriel stood as if in a trance. He had been saved. His daughter, his estate, his name all, saved by the woman he had so cruelly pushed away. He watched as Harriet stepped down from the stand, as Clara scrambled from her bench and ran to her, throwing her arms around Harrieta's waist. He watched them, the governess and the child, a tableau of trust and love that he had almost destroyed. The shame of it was a physical weight, heavier than any ducal coronet. That evening, the townhouse was quiet. But it was not the cold, dead quiet of before. It was the quiet of a storm that had passed. Alistair Finch was gone, his presence expunged from the house as thoroughly as his lies had been from the court record. Harriet was in her room, the room she had been about to vacate forever. Her trunk was still packed. She was folding the last of her things when a soft knock came at the door. It was Gabriel. He did not look like a duke. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and had been stripped of everything but the truth. He stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes holding an expression of such raw, agonizing self-reproach that she almost looked away. "They are preparing your rooms in the East Wing," he said, his voice husky. "The ones next to Clara's." "Ah," she continued, folding a shawl, her fingers steady. "Ah, that will not be necessary, Your Grace. I will be leaving in the morning. I stayed to see the matter through." "It is through." He took a step into the room. No," he said, "it is not." He walked to the window and looked out at the darkening square, his back to her. "I watched you leave this morning. I stood in the library window and I watched your cab pull away, and I thought I have just made the greatest mistake of my life." He turned to face her. "I told you to find someone who needs you," he said, his voice raw with the effort of confession. "I was a fool. A coward. I was describing myself. I did not have the courage to say it. I have spent my entire life hiding behind duty and control, and I did not know how to ask for help. I did not know how to admit that I needed you." He took another step closer. The space between them was charged, electric. "You walked into this house of ghosts, and you brought it back to life. You gave me back my daughter. You gave me back a myself. The debt is not financial, Miss Vance. It is mine. To you. And I do not think I can ever repay it." She finally looked up from her folding, her gaze clear and direct. She saw the truth in his eyes, the painful, unvarnished truth. But she had been wounded by him, and the wound was still tender. "Do not speak of repayment." "Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I will not be a debt on your ledger. Gratitude is not what I am owed." He flinched, but he did not look away. He absorbed the blow of her words. Knowing he deserved it, no," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It is not." He closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just before her. He reached out, not with the hesitant, aborted gesture from the hallway, but with a new, terrifying certainty. His hand came up, and gently, so gently, cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch that was both a question and a plea. Harriet," he said, her name, not Vance, not Miss Vance. "Harriet. My name is Gabriel." The walls were down, the ice was broken. He was no longer the Duke of Blackwood. He was just Gabriel, a man who had been lost and was miraculously found. What I feel for you is not gratitude," he said, his pale eyes searching hers. "I have been living in a frozen world for so long. I had forgotten what warmth felt like. You are that warmth. You are the heart of this house, the heart of my life, and I love you." He faltered on the last words, as if they were a foreign language he was speaking for the first time. "I love you. And if you leave, the cold will return. And this time, I do not think I will survive it." She looked at him, at this proud, broken, beautiful man, and saw the terror and the hope warring in his eyes. He had offered her a reference and a wage. Now he was offering her his heart, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was the truest account he had ever rendered. Slowly she raised her hand and covered his. "A Gabriel," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. And in that single word he heard her answer. He heard forgiveness. He heard acceptance. He heard home. 6 months later, the London townhouse was full of light. The heavy velvet curtains had been replaced with pale silk that let the sun stream in, illuminating the warm wood and polished brass. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of laughter, the quick patter of a child's feet, and the constant, cheerful click of an abacus being used, not as a talisman, but as a toy. Harriet, now the Duchess of Blackwood, sat in the library with her husband. The great ducal ledgers were spread out on the desk between them, but they were no longer a source of dread. They were a shared puzzle, a joint enterprise. He would read a column of figures, and she would make a note, her clear, elegant script a perfect complement to his bold scrawl. They were a partnership, in this as in all things. The portrait of the first Duchess, the brilliant mathematician, hung in its rightful place in the gallery. It had been Henrietta's first request. Her memory was not a ghost to be feared, but a presence to be honored. Clara would often stand before it and tell her new mother stories about her first one, stories Harriet always encouraged. This house had enough room for all its loves. Later that evening, Gabriel stood by the library door, watching his family. Harriet was sitting on the floor with Clara, the two of them bent over the abacus, their heads close together. Clara was explaining a complex sum to her mother, her voice bright with childish confidence. "And so you carry the 10, you see, Mama?" Clara said, sliding a jade bead with a flourish. "I see," Harriet said, her smile so full of love. He had sent her away. He had told her to find someone who needed her. And in his foolish, arrogant grief, he had been blind to the truth. She had not needed to go anywhere. The need, desperate and absolute, had been right here all along. He had almost lost everything, because he had been unable to read the most important ledger of all, his own heart. Harriet looked up and saw him watching. Her smile widened, a private knowing look that was just for him. She had balanced his books. She had cleared his emotional debts. She had taken a house of cold accounts and turned it into a home. She had become the woman who stayed. Wasn't that a story to warm the heart on a cold evening? The journey of a quiet woman who proves her worth not with beauty or charm, but with her mind and her integrity. What was your favorite moment? Was it when she faced down the Duke with her conditions, or her triumphant return to the courtroom? Let me know in the comments below where you're listening from and what you thought of Harriet's quiet strength. We love hearing from you, and your comments truly make our day. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more tales of love, loss, and redemption. We have a new story waiting for you tomorrow, and we cannot wait to share it with you. Until then, take care.